You're trying. That's the problem. Not the trying itself, but what it reveals about what you believe is necessary for something to change. There's a mechanism behind this that no one has shown you clearly. And as long as it remains invisible, you'll keep applying more force where no force is needed. Stay with that for a moment. There's a strange thing that happens when you observe people who get what they want with an ease that seems unfair. It's not that they try harder. It's not that they believe with greater intensity. It's not that they visualized more frequently or affirmed with more determination. There's something different at their starting point. Something in the internal structure before the action, not in the action itself. Most people don't investigate that point. They prefer to believe the difference lies in the technique. That if they find the right technique, the correct method, the most powerful practice, something will finally work. And that belief that the problem is the absence of the right technique is exactly what keeps the structure intact. Because the problem isn't the technique. It never was. The problem is the state from which the technique is applied. And that state, the 0 point before any intention, before any action, before any effort, is what Daniel calls the null state. Not because it's empty in the sense of absence, but because it's neutral in the sense of non-distorted. An internal field that isn't loaded with the urgency to change, the anxiety to achieve, the weight of who you believe yourself to be. Let's dismantle this carefully, because if you understand the mechanism behind it, not as belief but as structure, something will change in the way you perceive what you're doing. Think about how you normally try to create something, a different result in life, a change of circumstance, a way out of a pattern that keeps repeating. The process usually begins with a state of dissatisfaction. You notice that something isn't as it should be, and from that perception, an intention arises. I want this to change. The intention itself wouldn't be a problem. The problem is what comes along with it, the emotional charge of the dissatisfaction that generated the intention in the first place. This means that most of the time you're not creating from neutrality. You're creating from tension. And tension isn't just emotional, it's structural. It shapes the way you perceive what's possible, what's probable, what you deserve, what's going to happen. It distorts the perceptual field from which you act. And here's the invisible mechanism. Reality doesn't respond to your isolated intention. It responds to the state that carries the intention. This is precise. It isn't mystical. It's an observation about how human perception works, and how perception determines what you notice, what you interpret as a signal, what you decide to act on, what you dismiss as noise. When you're in tension, your perceptual system is calibrated to confirm the tension. You notice evidence that what you want is difficult. You interpret obstacles as confirmations that it won't work. You ignore side doors that were open all along, because the internal state wasn't calibrated to see them. When you're in neutrality, at the 0 point, the internal field without distortion, the perceptual system functions differently. Not because reality changed, but because what you can see within it changed. This isn't metaphor. It's the mechanism. Lara was 34 years old and worked as a systems analyst. She wasn't the type to seek personal development. She was skeptical, methodical, accustomed to solving problems with logic. But for 3 years she had been trying to change a situation at work that seemed impermeable. A toxic environment, leadership that ignored her, a growing sense of being stuck in a place that no longer made sense. She had tried everything within her repertoire. Direct conversations, formal documentation, transfer requests, new courses to reposition herself. Each attempt generated a result that seemed to confirm there was no way out. One Tuesday afternoon, she was sitting at her work desk waiting for a meeting to start. Her laptop was open, but she wasn't looking at it. She was simply still, not thinking about the problem, not trying to solve anything. For some reason, maybe exhaustion, maybe total saturation, she had simply stopped trying mentally. She noticed her right shoulder relax slightly downward, a small, almost imperceptible muscular release. And in that moment, without intention, without effort, a perception arose. She had never considered a third option that had been available for over a year. Not a grand revelation, just a connection that the tense mind hadn't made. Not because the information wasn't there, but because the internal state wasn't calibrated to connect it. 3 weeks later, she was in another department. Not because she had forced harder, but because, for a moment, she had stopped forcing completely. What happened to Lara wasn't luck. It was access. She accessed, momentarily and without intention, what Daniel describes as the 0 point of perception. The state where the mind stops filtering reality through the noise of urgency and begins to see it with more precision. And here begins the central paradox that this needs to dismantle carefully. The null state is not a state of passivity. It isn't giving up. It isn't indifference cultivated as a technique of emotional protection. These are distortions of the concept, and they're common because the mind that's still in tension tends to interpret neutrality as doing nothing or not caring. Neutrality is not the absence of intention. It's the absence of distortion in intention. You can want something deeply and still be in neutrality regarding it. What does that mean in practice? It means your intention isn't loaded with the weight of what will happen to you if you don't get it. It isn't contaminated by the identity that depends on the result to feel valid. It isn't being fed by the state of tension that generates the sensation of urgency. The difference between a charged intention and a neutral intention is subtle at first, but structurally enormous. And that difference determines what the internal system does with it. Let's go deeper. You have an identity. That seems obvious. But what that identity really is, what it does functionally, is less evident than it appears. Identity isn't just who you believe yourself to be. It's a system of filters that decides what is real, what is possible, what is probable, what you deserve, what will last, what will fall apart. It operates practically automatically, most of the time below the threshold of consciousness. And here is the mechanism that needs to be seen clearly. Identity is not neutral in relation to your intentions. It has an interest in the outcome, not in the sense of wanting you to succeed, but in the sense of wanting you to remain consistent with what it has already defined as true about you and about the world. This creates a paradoxical structure. You want to change. The identity wants consistency. And every time you try to change from the state of tension that dissatisfaction itself generates, you are, without realizing it, feeding the structure that keeps everything the same, because the attempt at force confirms to the internal system that change is difficult, that you need to force, that what you want is separated from you by resistance. Constant effort isn't just inefficient. It's structurally counterproductive because it communicates to the internal system a premise you don't want to communicate, that what you desire is outside, is difficult, and requires you to continuously force your way toward it. The null state, the absence of identity in the sense of absence of distortion, interrupts that circuit. Not because you stop wanting, but because you stop momentarily being the character who needs to force in order to get. There's a distinction Daniel considers fundamental, and that is rarely made with sufficient precision. The difference between what you want and who you are while wanting it. Most manifestation practices, visualization, or internal change focus on what you want. Clarity of intention, specificity of the outcome, frequency of visualization, intensity of emotion connected to desire. None of those practices are wrong. The problem is that all of them ignore the who that's doing the wanting, and the state of that who determines everything that the practice can or cannot do. If the who that's visualizing is an identity intention, the visualization isn't creating a state of receptivity. It's creating a state of anxiety with sharper images. If the who that's affirming is an identity that, deep down, doesn't believe what it's affirming, the affirmation isn't reprogramming anything. It's generating an internal dissonance that the system quickly resolves by returning to the state that feels most true. The problem isn't in the tool. It's in the state of the system that uses the tool. And that state, the field from which all intention emerges, is what can be calibrated. Not through more techniques, but through a structural understanding of what's happening inside the system while it tries. There's a phenomenon that anyone who has meditated for long enough recognizes, but that is rarely described with precision outside contemplative contexts. It happens when the mind finally stops producing content for a significant period. Not the superficial silence between two thoughts. Not the temporary calm that comes after a breathing exercise. But the absolute silence, the point where the observer and the observed collapse, where the mind is no longer generating narrative about reality, but simply existing as a field of perception without active processing. At that point, and this is what Daniel investigated for years before being able to articulate it with precision, something happens that cannot be produced by direct intention. The identity loses momentarily its habitual structure, not dramatically, not as mystical dissolution, but in the very concrete sense that the habitual filters it applies to perception become momentarily suspended. And in that suspension, perception becomes cleaner, not broader in the sense of seeing more things, more precise in the sense of seeing what's actually there without the distortion of the belief system that normally processes everything. This isn't a spiritual experience. It's a functional description of how the cognitive system operates when it isn't in defensive processing mode. And what makes this relevant to creation, to real change of circumstance, is that in that state of clean perception, connections that the tense mind cannot make become possible. Not because they appear from nowhere, but because the noise that covered them became quiet enough to be perceived. Let's talk about the mechanism of coherence, because this is the point where many people stop understanding, not from lack of intelligence, but from lack of the correct angle. Reality, and here we're talking about reality in the most concrete sense possible. Your relationships, your circumstances, your finances, your health, your work, is in large part a function of what you can perceive and what you decide to do with what you perceive. That doesn't deny external causes. It doesn't deny social structures or historical conditioning. It asserts only that, within given conditions, the margin of action you have is determined by the quality of your perception, and the quality of your perception is determined by the internal state from which it operates. Coherence, in this context, isn't a positive emotional state. It isn't feeling good or aligned in the popular sense of the term. It's a state where what you think, what you feel, and what you do are operating from the same fundamental premise, without that premise being contradicted by a subterranean internal state that affirms the opposite. When there is incoherence, and most people live in a chronic state of incoherence, the system spends most of its energy managing the internal contradiction. The conscious part affirms that it will succeed. The subterranean part operates from the belief that it won't. And the result, in practice, is fragmented action that sometimes advances, but frequently self-sabotages, procrastinates, or generates half-results. This isn't weakness of character. The system mechanics. The null state, the 0 point, the internal field without distortion, doesn't resolve incoherence by creating more positive beliefs. It resolves it by momentarily suspending the structure that generates the contradiction. And in that suspension, the action that emerges has a different quality. It is coherent not because you forced coherence, but because you exited the state that was generating incoherence. Here Daniel needs to be honest about something that most approaches avoid saying. The null state isn't permanent. It isn't a destination you reach and remain in. It's an access point, and the relevant skill isn't reaching it once, but recognizing it, returning to it, and eventually operating from it more frequently and more consistently. This is important because the expectation of permanence is itself a form of tension. Whoever seeks to achieve the null state definitively is, paradoxically, using the null state itself as an object of effort, which undoes the structure that makes it functional. The correct relationship with the null state isn't one of conquest. It's one of growing familiarity. You know it. You recognize when you're in it. You recognize when you've left it. And you learn over time to return without drama, without the narrative that you failed for having left, without the effort of trying to force the return. This has a practical implication that isn't obvious. The development of the capacity to access the null state isn't measured by how long you remain in it. It's measured by how quickly you notice you've left, and how lightly you return. A well-calibrated system isn't a system that never oscillates. It's a system that oscillates and recalibrates with fluidity. Let's talk about non-doing, because this is one of the most misunderstood concepts in the field of conscious creation, and also one of the most precise when understood correctly. Non-doing isn't inaction. That needs to be clear. It isn't the idea that you stop doing things and wait for reality to reorganize itself. That would be a naive distortion, and it isn't what Daniel investigates. Non-doing is a quality of action, not the absence of it. An action that emerges from the null state has a specific quality. It isn't loaded with the weight of an identity that needs a result in order to feel valid. It isn't contaminated by urgency that distorts judgment. It isn't being executed compulsively to relieve the anxiety of doing nothing, rather than because it genuinely makes sense to do it now. An action that emerges from the state of tension has a different quality. It's being executed as a response to internal discomfort, not as a response to clarity about what is needed. And actions executed as a response to internal discomfort rarely produce coherent results, because discomfort distorts judgment about what is truly necessary. The difference between action and non-doing isn't the presence or absence of physical movement. It's the internal origin of the movement, where it comes from, which state generated it. When you act from the null state, the action is precise. Not necessarily efficient in the sense of fast or intense, but precise in the sense of arising at the right moment, with the correct direction, without the noise that compulsive action carries. This explains why some people apparently do little and generate much, and why others do much and generate little. The quantity of action is a less relevant variable than the quality of the state from which the action emerges. Daniel spent several years observing this mechanism before being able to articulate it in a way that didn't sound like poorly packaged mysticism. The problem with most descriptions of the null state or analogous states in different traditions of consciousness investigation is that they depend on language that doesn't pass the test of conceptual precision. They speak of energy, vibration, frequency, universe, terms that have meaning within their reference systems, but that for an analytical mind function as noise, not as signal. What Daniel looks for is the mechanism, the structure, the how it works, not the why it exists in the metaphysical sense, but the how it operates in the functional sense. And what the investigation reveals is simple enough to fit in a few sentences, but deep enough to take years to fully integrate. The reality you experience is a function of the perceptual system you use to perceive it. That perceptual system is calibrated by the internal state from which it operates. That internal state can be investigated, understood, and gradually calibrated toward the 0 point. And from the 0 point, action and perception have a different quality, which generates different results not because you desired more or better, but because you acted from a state that wasn't distorting what was possible. This isn't the law of attraction. It isn't manifestation in the popular sense. It's an observation about how perception and internal state interact, and how that interaction determines the quality of action and, consequently, the quality of results. There's a question that inevitably arises when Daniel presents this mechanism. If the null state is the access point for more effective creation, how do you access that state? And the honest answer is paradoxical. You don't access the null state by trying to access it. The attempt to access is itself a form of tension, and tension is the opposite of what you're trying to cultivate. This isn't a mystical riddle. It's a precise description of a structural limitation. The null state cannot be produced by direct intention. It emerges when you stop trying to produce it. But that raises a legitimate question. So what does one do? The answer lies in an important distinction. You can't create the null state directly, but you can remove what blocks it. And what blocks it is always some form of active tension, some internal narrative underway, some identification with a result, some urgency that's being fed. Removing what blocks is different from creating what's missing. It's a movement of subtraction, not addition. And that distinction completely changes the practice. Instead of asking, what should I do to enter the null state? The more useful question is, what is active right now that keeps me outside it? Not as therapeutic analysis, as direct observation of what's happening internally right now, which tension, which narrative, which urgency is operating at this moment. And here is what Daniel has observed repeatedly. The simple act of observing what is active without judging, without trying to change, without adding narrative about why it's there, frequently dissolves enough of the tension for the internal state to recalibrate toward the 0 point. Not always, not completely, not permanently, but enough for perception to change. And when perception changes, the possible action changes, and the result changes in consequence. There's an error Daniel sees repeatedly in people who begin to investigate this mechanism. They adopt the null state as just another manifestation technique. They start trying to be neutral. They try not to care as a strategy to get what they want. They try to use non-attachment as a lever to attract what they desire. This is a conceptual collapse that undoes everything. The null state isn't a technique. It's a state, and the difference is crucial. When you use neutrality as a technique to achieve a result, you're not in neutrality. Your intention disguised as neutrality. The internal structure is still organized around the result, just in a more sophisticated way. And the system, which is far more perceptive than the conscious mind, recognizes that structure and responds to it, not to the performance of neutrality being displayed. The authenticity of the internal state cannot be effectively simulated. Not because there's some external agent evaluating the simulation, but because the simulation itself is a state, and it's that state that determines what the system perceives and how it acts. A genuine null state isn't trying to appear neutral. It is neutral. And the difference between those two cases is all the difference. Let's talk about identity again, but from a different angle. Identity isn't a thing you have. It's a process that happens continuously. At every moment, the system is confirming and reaffirming its identity structure through micro-interpretations of what's happening. You see something. Before consciously processing what you saw, it has already passed through an identity filter that decides what it means in relation to who you are and what's possible for you. That process is so fast and so automatic that it seems to be reality itself. not an interpretation of it. And here's the point. The null state doesn't destroy identity. That isn't what happens. What happens is that, momentarily, the process of identity confirmation becomes suspended. The automatic interpretation loses speed. And in that deceleration, there's a space very small but real between the stimulus and the response. Between what happens and what you decide it means. That space is where real freedom exists. Not in the sense of absolute freedom from determinism, but in the very concrete sense that, in that space, a different response becomes possible, because it isn't being predetermined by the identity filter that normally decides before you realize you're deciding. Viktor Frankl described something similar from a different perspective. Daniel arrived at the same point by another path. The convergence is significant. Between stimulus and response there is a space. In that space lies the power to choose. And in the choice lie growth and freedom. But to access that space, for it to exist functionally, and not just as a concept, the system needs to be in a state that allows the deceleration of the automatic interpretive process. And that state is the 0 point. Here Daniel wants to talk about something that most approaches avoid saying honestly, the cost of the null state. Because there is a cost. And ignoring it is a way of romanticizing the concept in a manner that makes it inaccessible in practice. The state of tension, constant effort, urgency, compulsive attempts to control outcomes has a function. It gives the sensation that you're doing something. It temporarily relieves the anxiety of not acting. It offers a narrative of oneself as someone who is trying, who isn't giving up, who is being responsible for their own destiny. The null state removes that narrative. And for many people, the identity that depends on the narrative of, I'm someone who tries very hard, resists the null state with considerable force, because the null state appears to that identity as surrender, as passivity, as irresponsibility. That resistance isn't weakness. It's the identity system doing what it always does, protecting its structure. Understanding this without judgment, without drama, is part of the process. You won't eliminate the resistance by forcing neutrality, but by recognizing that the resistance is a function of identity, and not a truth about what is necessary, you create the space for it to lose some of its force. And when it loses force, the system recalibrates. Not all at once. Gradually. With relapses. With moments of clarity followed by moments of renewed tension. But the direction changes. And when the direction changes, the results begin to change. Not dramatically at first, but consistently over time. There's a sentence Daniel uses frequently that will seem too simple for what it implies. The mechanism isn't out there. It's in the state from which you look out there. It isn't philosophical idealism. It isn't the assertion that external reality doesn't exist or that everything is mental projection. It's a much more precise and concrete assertion that what you can see, interpret, and act on within external reality is determined by the internal state from which you operate. And that internal state, by default, is distorted. Not from moral defect. By system design, a system calibrated for survival, for threat, for confirmation of what it already believes to be true. A system that, without conscious investigation, will continue operating from its default settings indefinitely. The conscious investigation of the internal state, the practice of observing what is operating, of recognizing when you're in tension or in neutrality, of learning to return to the 0 point with more ease, isn't spiritual development in the religious sense. It's system calibration. It's engineering applied to perception. And the result of that calibration, when done with consistency, with honesty, without romanticization, is a mode of operation that looks, from the outside, very much like what some people call flow or grace or inexplicable ease. But that from the inside is simply the result of a system operating without the noise that previously made it inefficient. Daniel wants to talk now about what happens on the other side, not as promise but as description of the mechanism in the opposite direction. When the system is calibrated to operate more frequently from the 0 point, some things change in ways that seem counterintuitive. The first, you act less, but with more precision. The actions you take emerge from clarity, not from urgency. And because they emerge from clarity, they tend to be more effective, not because you did more, but because what you did was genuinely what was necessary at that moment. The second, your perception of opportunity changes. Not because more opportunities appear, but because the system that was filtered by the tension of urgency begins to perceive connections and possibilities that were present before and were ignored. Lara had already seen that transfer option. But the state she was in wasn't calibrated to perceive it as a real possibility. The third, and this is the most subtle, the relationship with the result changes. Not in the sense that you care less, but in the sense that the result loses its power to define what you are. You can deeply want something to happen and, at the same time, not be dependent on it for your internal coherence. And that combination, clear intention without dependence on the result, is precisely the structure that generates the greatest effectiveness of action. There's one last layer Daniel wants to dismantle: the question of time. The mind intention operates with temporal urgency. It needs the change to happen now, not because now is the ideal moment, but because the discomfort of waiting is unbearable to the system intention. And that temporal urgency is yet another form of distortion that compromises the quality of action. When you act from temporal urgency, you tend to choose the most immediately accessible action over the most coherent action. You tend to sacrifice precision for speed. You tend to override signals that the direction isn't right because stopping seems worse than continuing in the wrong direction. The null state dissolves temporal urgency without creating apathy. You still operate in time, still have objectives, still act, still produce. But the relationship with timing changes. You become more capable of waiting for the precise moment of action without the anguish that waiting means losing. More capable of interrupting a line of action that isn't generating results without the narrative that interrupting means failure. This seems small. In practice, it's structurally transformative because most of the poor decisions people make are made from poorly calibrated temporal urgency. The null state emerged from the need to go beyond traditional manifestation techniques. It was created to help you understand and sustain that internal point of neutrality where effort disappears and reality begins to respond coherently. More than learning something new, it's a process of dismantling the identity that forces, allowing change to happen through alignment and not through tension. If you felt, throughout this video, that there's something here that goes beyond a new idea, that touches a mechanism you already intuited but couldn't articulate, then perhaps it makes sense to go deeper. There's material available for deeper exploration. It isn't mandatory. It's for those who feel that this investigation makes sense to continue. For those who perceive that understanding the mechanism is only the beginning, and that real integration requires a more structured practice. The link is in the pinned comment if you want to access it. And now, before closing, Daniel has a simple request. Write in the comments your name and a single word that describes what you felt while listening to this. Can be silence, can be coherence, can be neutrality, can be recognition, or any other word that is honest about what happened internally while this mechanism was being dismantled. One word. Your name. That's all. To close, you're not here because you didn't try hard enough. You're here because you tried, and you noticed that something in the mechanism still wasn't clear. That perception is already the beginning of change. Not because perceiving solves it, but because perceiving correctly opens the space where the real solution becomes possible. Absolute silence isn't the opposite of creation. It's the point from which all genuine creation emerges. Not as absence of action, as absence of distortion. That is the difference. And it is everything.